Hello and welcome to New Wave Global. I'm back with my daily updates of what is happening around the world. So, today I want to talk about this really important story that was published by the very famous CBC outlet, which is Canada based. And this report basically paints a really alarming picture about how the Canadian elections were targeted or interfered with by both Pakistan and India, the South Asian countries which have a huge diaspora in Canada, and the spy agency documents which were tabled at the Foreign Interference Inquiry show that in 2019 and 2021, the elections were targeted. The governments of India and Pakistan were trying to interfere in the federal elections. And these documents came out on this week, just a couple of days ago. In 2021, the government of India, according to CBC, had intent to interfere and likely conducted clandestine activities. Unquote. This is what the report says, including the use of an Indian government proxy agent in Canada, and this is an unclassified summary written by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS. 2 years earlier, in 2019, the CSIS report says government of Pakistan officials in Canada attempted to influence Canadian federal politics with the aim of furthering the government of Pakistan's interest in Canada. This is what the CSIS has said. Now, in South Asia, especially in Pakistan, we are very much used to citing the foreign interference in either elections or change of governments or change of prime ministers. But this is kind of a reversal where these two countries are trying to influence the outcome of Canadian elections. So the CBC report says that the stark assessments um, in these documents, which were tabled as part of the Federal Commission of Inquiry into Foreign Interference, paint a really grim picture. And this public inquiry is also examining possible interference by China, Russia, and others in the previous elections, federal elections in Canada. The reports all bear notes of caution about the summaries being possibly uncorroborated, single-sourced, or incomplete. CSIS director uh, told the public inquiry that the intelligence was not necessarily fact and that it may require further investigation. So the CBC also reached out to the Indian and Pakistani authorities, the high commissions, but quite obviously they did not get a response. Asked whether India and Pakistan should be considered threats to Canada's electoral system, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his government had taken, quote unquote, significant measures to counter foreign interference, unquote. Uh, he further said, we have known for many, many years that many different countries take an interest in engaging Canadian institutions and sometimes influencing, sometimes interfering in the work of Canadian institutions. Trudeau said this in a news conference. But of course, like in a typical politician's way, he assured the people that, him and his government would do everything possible to stop such interference. Now, Pakistan, interestingly, is a limited foreign interference actor, and quite obviously, so Pakistan is not, let's say, as influential or powerful as India. And their foreign interference, as the CSIS assessment says, was primarily to promote political security and economic stability in Pakistan and to counter India's growing global influence. Now, with Pakistan, almost always, whatever interference or interventions it makes on the international arena or in foreign climes, it is largely in response to India or to, counter, as they say, the Indian influence or put across Pakistani perspective. And that's why CSIS said that in the 2019 election, the Canadian government conducted what it called a threat reduction measure ahead of the vote meant to reduce the foreign interference threat posed by the government of Pakistan. The situation was monitored and assessed to have effectively reduced the threat of interference. That's what CSIS says. Now, the Indian cases and the so-called Indian alleged interference is a little bit different. So CSIS alleges that in 2021, the Indian government's interference activities were centered on a small number of electoral districts. The government of India targeted those ridings because there was a perception that a portion of Indo-Canadian voters was sympathetic to the Khalistani movement or pro-Pakistan political stances. Now, of course, CBC is reporting like that. The Khalistani movement is basically by the Sikhs who are aggrieved by the Indian Union and its policies and the past, especially the rioting and violence in the 1980s. And there are some movements largely overseas, not as big or overplayed as the Indian government thinks or Pakistan might hope that they are separatist movements. And so because Pakistan supports this Khalistani cause, so this cause is viewed as pro-Pakistani. Well, in Pakistan, conversely, the separatist movements are always considered to be Indian funded or Indian backed, and therefore they are seen as pro-India. The Khalistan movement, just to clarify, again, for those who may not know, those who are not of South Asian origin watching this video, is a separatist movement that aims to carve out an independent Sikh nation in the northern Indian state of Punjab. The Indian government has, maintained for a long time that this independence movement undermines India's national security. And so the Canadian intelligence assessment goes on to say that it amassed a body of intelligence that indicates that the government of India, quote unquote, proxy agent, may have attempted to interfere in democratic processes by providing illegal financing support to pro-Indian candidates. Any such financial contribution could have remained unknown to the candidate, the CSIS adds. Now, this is all a bit problematic because if you can't really follow the money, then you can't make such a big allegation, right? The CSIS memo does not identify the specific ridings or candidates that may have been subject to India's meddling in 2021. And so the proxy agent that the CSIS says is or defines is a specific individual who takes explicit and or implicit direction from a foreign state while obfuscating the link between influence activities and a foreign state. Proxy agents are based in Canada. They may not necessarily belong to a specific diaspora community and are witting participants in furthering the objective of the foreign state in specific circumstances, says the CSIS. These documents or the unclassified summaries of intelligence, uh, you know, they focus on electoral surveillance and Global Affairs Canada, the Privy Council Office, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and public safety in Canada. Pakistan and India were not the focus of testimony during this phase of the foreign interference public inquiry, which started last week. The proceedings have largely been geared toward alleged foreign interference by China, but the two South Asian countries have come up in other documents tabled at the inquiry. A summary of an October 2022 meeting between CSIS and the Office of the Commissioner of the Canada elections uh, said that the two main state actors involved in the last election were China and India. Now, this is again a very serious and interesting finding. And a public summary of a classified CSIS briefing provided to political parties dated June 2019 lists India and Pakistan among other state actors that could engage in meddling in Canada, according to this CBC report. Redacting a word that appears right before the word Pakistani in a sentence, the briefing goes on to say Pakistani officials in Canada have likely tried to influence and support Canadian politicians of Pakistani descent with the aim of furthering Pakistani interests in China. So, 3 out of the 5 paragraphs about India in that briefing note are largely redacted, but it says Indian officials have utilized a network of contacts, which includes politicians, academics, business persons, media personalities, and community leaders to monitor Canada-based individuals that are of interest to Government of India. CSIS also wrote, according to CBC, that it has observed that there have been Indian interference activities targeted at Canadian members of parliament, provincial legislative members, outside the scope of regular diplomatic norms. In July 2021, the Security Intelligence Threats to Elections SITE task force, it's a Canadian government body with all senior civil servants and other bodies, held a briefing to alert political parties to lessons learned from the 2019 election. SITE wrote that in 2019, it observed foreign interference activities targeting certain ridings and candidates in relation to the election, directed largely from China and to a lesser extent from India and Pakistan through the use of human agents. And the document goes on to say that none of these activities met the threshold to pursue criminal investigations. So, which basically means it's like a mild or low grade interference, not really mega interference. As on India, side said that the briefing that in the briefing said that the country is actively conducting foreign interference and targets Canadian political figures. Working through Indian officials in Canada, India engages in a range of activities that seek to influence Canadian communities and politicians in order to advance its political interests. Now, this is obviously bound to happen. I mean, there's a large Indian diaspora in Canada, there's a large Pakistani diaspora, and obviously their home connections or the countries that they come from, and the kind of political mobilization that they create or lead in countries like Canada, Europe, or the United States, obviously concerns their home country governments. So, but I think this also calls into question the veracity of the reports by the Canadian intelligence, because it should be reminded that they are themselves admitting that the evidence or that the evidence may not be final and that further investigation is needed. Anyway, this is a really interesting moment. We had heard of Russia interfering in US presidential election, or China trying to influence the current election because that's what Western media is reporting, or that in the past other countries have done that, but for India and Pakistan to do that in Canada is something that ought to be talked about. We shall explore this further, and until the next video, goodbye.